Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I was driving alone through southern Wyoming on Christmas Eve, trying to reach my brother in Rock Springs before the storm rolled over the whole stretch of highway. The wind had been pushing my small car around since Rawlins, but the empty space between towns made it worse. There was nothing to block the gusts, just open land and low, rolling desert hills. Every time a stronger wave of wind hit the car, the tires slid half a foot sideways on the thin layer of packed snow. I kept gripping the steering wheel tighter, trying to breathe slow, but the whole highway looked like one endless sheet of white. No edges, no center lines, just white. It felt like driving inside a blank page. I had been on the road too long, and my eyes were burning from trying to focus on something that wasn't even there. The storm clouds were stacking up behind me, the kind that looked heavy enough to break the sky. I didn't want to stop, but I could feel my hands shaking. When I saw the rest stop near Red Desert coming up through the blur of snow, I pulled in without thinking twice, almost relieved to see the shape of a building. There was only one other vehicle parked there, an old gray pickup, frost covering every window. It looked like it had been sitting there for a while. The bed was coated in a layer of wind, packed snow that made the edges soft, like a frozen dune had formed on it. I didn't pay much attention at first. People stop at those rest areas all the time, but when I opened my door and stepped out, I noticed footprints in the snow leading away from the truck. Not toward the building, but toward the dark, low hills behind the rest stop. The footprints were deep, spaced far apart, like whoever made them had been running or at least moving fast enough to lift their feet high each step. I stood there for a long moment, letting the wind hit my face, trying to make sense of why someone would run off into the hills on a night like this. The wind was strong enough that it wiped out the edges of the footprints a little. But the direction was clear, straight into nothing, straight into cold and dark. The rest stop building was a small square box with dull yellow lights showing through the windows. I pushed inside, grateful for even a tiny break from the wind. The place smelled like old air vents and stale mop water. The lights buzzed, one of those high, pitched tones that you feel in your teeth. I went straight to the bathroom because I just wanted to get back on the road and not think about anything else. Inside, the bathroom was colder than I expected. The sink pipes must have run near the outside wall because I could feel the cold coming off it. When I bent down to wash my hands, I noticed something stuck under the sink, wedged between the pipe and the wall. A glove. A thick winter glove that used to be black but was now coated with frost and stiff with frozen blood. The blood had that dark, almost purple look it gets when it's been outside in the cold too long. I stared at it longer than I should have. I don't even know why. Maybe because it felt out of place. Maybe because the footprints outside were already stuck in my head. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. I just kept looking at it until I realized my breathing was turning shallow and fast. Something about it bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. My skin felt too tight, and my stomach started to sink into itself. When I turned off the faucet, I heard something outside. Not a scream, not talking, not anything you could mistake for a person yelling. Just a quick snapping sound. Clean and sharp, like someone stepped on a frozen crust of ice. One fast crack that echoed slightly through the walkway outside the bathroom door. My hands were still wet, but I didn't even bother drying them. I backed out of the bathroom, pushed through the building doors, and stepped into the wind again. Snow was blowing harder now, fast enough to sting my face. I couldn't see anyone out there, only the shadows moving across the ground from the rest stop lights. But I felt something, more like the sense that something had changed in the few minutes I was inside. I hurried toward my car, and the snow felt slick under my boots. I slipped twice, catching myself with my hands the first time and landing on my knee the second. I didn't even care about the pain. I just wanted to get in the car and leave. When I reached the driver door and yanked it open, something made me look back over my shoulder before I got inside. Maybe instinct, maybe fear. Fresh footprints were in the snow. Not mine. The ones leading from the pickup toward the hills were still there. though a bit more blurred by the wind. These new ones were different. They came from the direction of the gray truck and went straight toward the rest stop building, straight toward the bathroom I had just walked out of. The snow was falling fast, so they had to be recent. Seconds recent. Whoever made them was close enough that I should have been able to see them. But the space between the pickup and the building was empty. Then I noticed something else. The old gray pickup's driver door was open now. Not wide, but open enough that the wind kept moving it back and forth an inch or two. That steady hinge creak was faint but clear under the wind. I didn't want to look inside the truck, and I didn't. I dropped into my seat so fast I hit my elbow on the door frame. I locked the doors, turned the engine, and didn't bother brushing off the windshield. The wipers pushed the snow aside just enough for me to see the highway. I backed up too fast, tires slipping, and almost skidded into one of the light poles. The second my wheels touched the exit ramp back onto the highway, I felt my whole body buzzing with fear. Not panic exactly. More like a cold realization that I had walked into something I didn't understand and didn't want to understand. Something real. Something human. Something dangerous. The storm had caught up by then. Snow was blowing across the highway in long white sheets. The wind kept hitting the side of the car, but I didn't slow down. I didn't want to be anywhere near that rest stop. My eyes kept checking the rearview mirror, even though there was nothing but darkness and blowing snow behind me. Every time the mirror caught the reflection of my brake lights, it made my chest tighten, like I expected to see someone standing in the road behind me. For miles, I couldn't shake the image of that glove under the sink. The dark frozen blood, the footprints leading out into the hills, and those fresh ones leading to the restroom door just minutes after I had gone inside. I kept thinking about how far those hills went, how easy it would be for someone to disappear out there, how the wind could erase almost anything. I didn't stop again until I saw the first faint glow of the Rock Springs lights through the snow. The town looked like a warm cluster of tiny dots spread across the dark. When I finally reached my brother's street, I parked and sat there for a long time before getting out. My hands were stiff on the steering wheel, and my heartbeat felt like it had sunk into my stomach. I knew I had made it out of that rest stop, and I knew I hadn't seen whoever made those footprints. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked right past someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone hiding in the wind and the snow, close enough to hear my footsteps, close enough to know I was alone. Even now, when I think about that night, the cold that hits me isn't from the weather. It's from knowing how close I came to something out there in the dark. Something that had already left blood behind. Something moving fast through the snow, leaving deep, wide footprints. Something real, human, and still out there somewhere in those low hills of southern Wyoming. When I walked into my brother's house, the warmth felt unreal. I shut the door behind me, but it didn't matter. The storm outside could close roads and bury the footprints and hide every sign of that rest stop. But I knew exactly what I had seen. I knew what I heard. I knew how close danger had been, even if I couldn't see the person attached to those tracks. The ending was simple and clear in my head when I sat down on the couch. I made it to safety because I ran. Because I didn't stop to check the truck. Because I didn't follow the footprints. Because I trusted that fear and left the second something felt wrong. That rest stop is still there, and people still pass by it every day, but I will never stop at it again. Not after seeing those footprints appear out of nowhere in fresh snow. Not after hearing that sharp crack like someone stepping too close. Not after knowing that someone out there was moving fast, leaving blood behind, and getting closer by the minute. I survived because I drove away. That's the only reason the story ends where it does. During Christmas week, I drove out to my storage unit on the east side of Kansas City, the one I had kept for years because I never got around to sorting all my old stuff. It was one of those long metal buildings divided into narrow rows, with a second floor you reached by a concrete stairwell that always felt colder than the outside air. The wind that day carried the sharp smell of winter, but the moment I stepped into the building, the air shifted to that strange mix of dust, old plywood, and cold metal that I always remembered. It felt stale, like the place had been sealed for too long. I went up to the second floor, listening to the echo of my steps bounce off the narrow hallway. The lights overhead were thin fluorescent tubes that buzzed faintly and flickered every few seconds. The hallway was long enough that one end seemed to disappear into a dim blur. My unit was near the very back, the kind of spot no one would walk past unless they had a reason to be there. I unlocked the door with the heavy brass lock I had bought when I first rented the unit. I always used the same lock because it felt solid. When I pushed the roll-up door, it rattled along the tracks and lifted with that familiar scrape. The smell inside was stronger than the hallway, like old cardboard and wood shavings. I stepped in and pulled the string on the small bulb inside. The light was weak and yellow, but enough to see the boxes stacked along the back wall. I crouched down and started pulling out the plastic bins with my Christmas decorations. I had wreaths in one, old snow globes wrapped in towels in another, and a box of tree lights that always got tangled no matter how carefully I packed them. While I was sorting through everything, I heard a metallic clatter behind me in the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make me freeze. I turned and looked out into the hallway. It was empty, completely empty. The echo of the sound lingered longer than it should have, like it had bounced around inside the walls instead of the open space. I waited for a moment, thinking maybe another renter had come through and dropped something. But the hallway stayed silent, just the faint buzz of the lights. I turned back to my unit and kept working, but the sound had made the back of my neck feel tight. I tried to shake it off. As I pulled out the next bin, my eyes fell on something that didn't belong. My camping stove was sitting right in the middle of the floor. It was a small metal stove I kept with my outdoor gear, and I always stored it in the far back corner on top of a rubber bin, facing the wall. Seeing it right in the open didn't make sense. I hadn't touched it in months. I tried to tell myself maybe I had moved it the last time I came here, but I knew I hadn't. I remembered exactly how everything was arranged. I always put things back the same way so the unit didn't feel chaotic. Next to the stove was a half-frozen water bottle, one of those cheap, clear plastic ones. Someone had squeezed it enough that the sides were dented. I hadn't brought it there, and I never left water in my unit. When I picked it up out of reflex, I smelled cigarettes on it, like someone who smoked had been drinking from it recently. That smell cut through the cold air in a way that made my chest feel hollow. I stood there longer than I should have, just staring at the stove and the bottle. My mind tried to explain it in a normal way. Maybe the staff had checked the units. Maybe someone mixed up my lock. Maybe something got knocked over by vibrations or something shifting over time. But none of it fit. My unit didn't shift like that. No one should have been inside. And I had locked it tight. That was when I noticed the lock. It wasn't my lock on the door. When I first arrived, I didn't think much about it because I was cold and moving fast. But now that I looked at it again, it was obvious. Someone had replaced my heavy brass lock with a cheap, thin silver padlock, the kind you could buy in a discount hardware bin for a few dollars. It was scratched and dull, like it had been used before. My lock was nowhere in sight. When I saw that, my stomach tightened in a slow, heavy way, like something inside me understood the situation before my thoughts caught up. Someone had been in my storage unit. Someone had spent time inside it long enough to move things around, drink from a bottle, and leave their things behind. And I had walked right in without knowing anything. I decided to leave. I didn't want anything from the unit anymore. Decorations didn't matter. I turned off the bulb, stepped out into the hallway, and pulled the door down. The metal slammed shut and echoed down the hall, sharper than I meant it to. The hallway lights flickered harder than before, like they reacted to the noise. I started walking toward the stairwell. Halfway down the hall, everything went dark. The lights went out in one large click, like someone had hit a breaker. The only thing left was the faint red glow of the exit sign at the far end. The air felt heavier in the darkness. I stood still for a second, waiting for the lights to come back on, but they didn't. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow, steady, and directly above me. There wasn't a third floor. The building only had 2 levels. The roof was just a thin layer of metal. Yet the footsteps were clear, like someone was walking in a straight line over my head. The sound didn't match the roof either. It wasn't the hollow tin sound of something hitting metal. It sounded heavier, like boots on wood. I couldn't move for a moment. My legs felt locked into place. I forced myself to breathe slow and quiet. The footsteps kept going, crossing the ceiling from one side of the hallway to the other, stopping somewhere above the row of units where mine was. I didn't call out. I didn't even think of speaking. I didn't want whoever it was to know exactly where I was. All I wanted was to get out. I walked quickly toward the stairwell, staying close to the wall so I could feel my way forward. The exit sign glowed just enough to guide me. Every few steps, I heard something above shift slightly, like weight shifting from one foot to the other. When I reached the stairwell door, I pushed it open. The stairwell was pitch black except for the small window at the bottom that let in some light from outside. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see anything behind me. I went down the concrete steps fast, my shoes scraping against the rough surface. When I burst out into the cold air of the parking lot, it felt like stepping into another world. Everything was quiet. The building looked normal from the outside, just a plain storage facility with rows of locked units. My breath came out in shaky clouds. I kept walking backward until I reached my car. When I stopped and looked back at the building, I saw the hallway lights inside come on again. Not all at once. They clicked on one at a time, starting from the far end and moving toward the stairwell, like someone was walking slowly down the hallway flipping switches. The pattern was too deliberate to be random. When the last light turned on near the door, I got into my car and drove away without looking back. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. I never returned to that storage unit. I called the company the next day and told them to clear it out. I didn't want anything inside anymore. I didn't want to know who had been in there, or how long they had been using it. I didn't want to know what the footsteps meant, or how someone could move through the building without ever being seen. I didn't even want my decorations back. I just wanted distance between myself and whatever had been in that hallway with me on Christmas week. I never rented another unit again. I kept everything in my own home after that, where I could hear every sound and know exactly who was moving around in the dark. I rented the cabin near Baxter State Park with the hope of finding some peace over Christmas. The year had been exhausting, full of work stress, personal losses, and constant noise from city life. I needed isolation, quiet, and a chance to breathe without feeling pressured or watched. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone fireplace that looked like it had been in use for decades. The owner had left a stack of firewood by the side door and a short note warning me that heavy snowstorms were common in that area this time of year. He said to be careful on the unpaved road leading up to the cabin and to always keep extra wood and supplies in case I got snowed in. It sounded idyllic on paper, and I convinced myself that I could handle a few days alone. The first night passed quietly. I lit the fireplace before dark and spent the evening reading a paperback I had brought along. The snow had started falling lightly in the late afternoon, turning the trees into perfect white silhouettes. Inside, the cabin felt warm and cozy. I made a small dinner of canned soup, bread, and some cheese I had packed. The kind of simple, solitary meal that seemed to fit the quiet calm I was seeking. I went to bed early, the rhythmic patter of snow against the roof like a lullaby. The second night, things started to feel different. I was already in bed, the heat from the fireplace having dwindled to soft embers. Around midnight, I thought I heard a faint crunching outside, the kind of sound snow makes when someone or something walks on it. At first, I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox moving through the forest. Animals were normal here, and the snow could amplify even small movements. But then I noticed the pattern. Step, pause, and then a longer pause, repeated over and over, circling the cabin in slow, deliberate loops. My heart started to race. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. Animals didn't pause like that, didn't measure their steps with such care, and definitely didn't move in perfect circles around a cabin like they were studying it. I got out of bed, trying to keep calm. My bedroom window faced the front of the cabin, and I crept to it quietly, careful not to make any noise on the creaking wooden floor. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The snow was falling steadily, blanketing everything in white, but I could see the tracks. Deep, sharply defined boot prints, perfectly spaced, forming a ring around the cabin. Whoever had walked here had heavy boots, the kind that make a firm imprint in snow when you press down with each step. The prints stopped directly under my window. I could make out the outline of the tread pattern, a zigzag design, and I noticed that the snow between the prints had only a thin layer of fresh snowfall, meaning whoever had walked there had been outside just minutes ago, but somehow the snow hadn't covered their steps fully yet. I froze for a long time, my breath fogging the inside of the glass. I felt completely exposed, alone in this small cabin with someone outside, circling it. I considered calling the police, but my phone signal was almost non-existent. Even if I tried, it might not connect, and there was no guarantee anyone could reach me quickly through the snow and forest. Panic began to claw at my chest. I moved slowly, quietly, to make sure I didn't draw attention. I checked the back of the cabin through the kitchen window. The snow was undisturbed except for the same circular pattern, moving methodically around the structure. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't touched the door. They hadn't climbed the porch or smashed a window. They had only circled, making sure I could see their presence. It was deliberate, intimidating, carefully planned to make me aware they were there without ever coming inside. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. I kept my eyes on the window listening. The crunching had stopped, but the silence outside was almost worse. The wind had picked up, blowing snow across the ground, and I could see the tracks fading slightly with the drifting flakes. My mind raced with possibilities. Who would come out here on Christmas night to circle an abandoned cabin? Was it someone lost, some hiker gone astray? That seemed unlikely. The tracks were too purposeful, too confident. It was someone who knew exactly where they were, someone who wanted me to see them. Morning came slowly. I sat up in bed, staring at the faint gray light outside. Snow had continued to fall, piling higher against the cabin walls. I got dressed slowly, trying not to rush, scanning the windows and doors as I went. That's when I noticed the second set of prints. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the forest. Unlike the circular set from the night before, these walked straight in single file, moving deeper into the woods. The snow by the door was untouched, exactly as it had been when I first looked in the middle of the night. Whoever it had been, they had gone around every window, made their point, and left without ever approaching the entrance. The thought made my stomach twist. They had watched me sleep. They had made sure I knew someone had been there, but they didn't break in. It was not careless, it was intentional, precise. I went outside cautiously. The cold hit my face like a slap, and the snow crunched loudly under my boots. I followed the circular tracks carefully, noting how they overlapped with the prints that now led away. The deeper tracks suggested someone heavy, not in a rush, walking with purpose. There was no sign of struggle, no drag marks, nothing that suggested they had been carrying anything. Just boots, snow, and the cold, silent forest surrounding them. My eyes moved constantly, scanning the tree line, trying to see movement, but it was empty, just trees heavy with snow. I even checked behind the porch railing and around the sides of the cabin, expecting some hidden entry point. Nothing. No sign of footprints other than the ones I had seen from the night. Whoever it was had left no trace except what they wanted me to see. Then I noticed the small piece of paper. It was partially buried in the snow at the corner of the porch, flattened by the frost but still intact. I picked it up carefully, shivering despite my layers, and unfolded it. In pencil and careful, slightly shaky letters, were 3 words: "I saw you." The pencil marks were faint but legible. My first reaction was disbelief. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? Who would go to such lengths, risk walking outside in freezing snow, and write something like this for a stranger? And why? The thought of it sitting there, under my hand, written in the dead of night, made my chest tighten. It confirmed every fear, every small suspicion that had crept into my mind since I first heard the crunching outside. I brought the paper inside and sat at the small wooden table near the window, trying to process what had happened. I didn't sleep the night before, and now the morning light did little to calm me. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a local, someone who knew the cabin was rented for the holidays. Maybe they thought it would be funny to scare a lone person. But the precision, the calculated circling of the cabin, the avoidance of the door, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like someone was marking their presence, watching, and deliberately reminding me that I was alone and vulnerable. My mind refused to accept that it was harmless. The next hours passed slowly. I kept the fire going, checked all the windows and doors repeatedly, and even moved furniture in front of the largest windows just in case. I didn't want to go outside alone anymore. Didn't want to step onto the porch. Didn't want to see footprints or notes or anything else. I considered leaving immediately, but the snowstorm had strengthened. The road down to the main highway looked treacherous. One wrong move, one skid on the icy path, and I could be stranded, or worse. So I stayed, trying to occupy myself with chores I hadn't gotten to the day before, stacking firewood neatly, cleaning up the small kitchen, even organizing supplies in the pantry. It was a way to keep my mind occupied, to avoid thinking about the fact that someone had been right outside, circling me like a predator studying its prey. By the afternoon, I resolved to leave the cabin as soon as it was safe. The storm had slowed to a light snowfall, and the road looked passable though risky. I packed quickly, throwing essentials into my backpack, making sure the keys were in my pocket, and double-checking that the fire was completely out. The cabin felt different than when I had arrived. The warmth, the quiet charm. It all felt tainted by the knowledge that someone had been outside watching me, possibly just feet away, just the night before. Every corner, every window, every shadowed part of the room reminded me of that crunching sound. I wanted to get away from it, away from the isolation that made me visible, away from the forest that had concealed whoever it was. I stepped outside into the cold. The snow crunched under my boots, the smell of frozen pine and earth sharp in the air. The circular tracks were still visible, slowly filling in with new snow, and the straight tracks leading into the forest had all but vanished. I didn't care to follow them. I wanted the road, the car, civilization, something that would guarantee safety. The trek to the car was slow, careful. Every shadow seemed to move. Every branch snapping under the snow felt like a warning. But I kept moving, reminding myself that I wasn't trapped, that I could leave this place. And eventually I made it to the car. The tires crunched as I started the engine, the heater flooding the cabin with warm air. I sat for a moment, heart still racing, staring at the cabin in the distance. The snow softened its lines, made it look peaceful, innocent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The tracks, the paper, the circling, they had been real. Whoever it was had chosen to leave without breaking in, and that decision had spared me. But it didn't erase the fear, the knowledge that someone had been outside watching, and could have done much worse if they had wanted. I drove slowly down the winding road, glancing at the forested edges, alert to any movement, any sign of life. The snowstorm made the journey difficult, but the fear pushed me forward faster than any concern for slipping on the ice. By the time I reached the main road, the feeling of being watched had faded, but only slightly. It lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet warning that the forest could hide people just as easily as it hid the snow-covered trees. I told myself it was over, that I had escaped, but the memory of the 3 words on the paper, "I saw you," stayed with me, burned into my mind as a stark reminder that solitude in a remote place could come with consequences. Even now, weeks later, I avoid that area, and any time I hear footsteps in the snow, I think back to that night, the circling, the silence, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will. The memory of those precise, purposeful steps in the snow, and the small folded paper with its simple message, is something I carry with me, a warning that isolation can make you visible to the wrong eyes, and that sometimes, simply being alone is enough to invite danger. The experience changed the way I think about being alone in remote places. I now understand how vulnerability is magnified when there's no one to see what's happening, no phone signal, no easy escape. I learned to respect the wilderness not just for its beauty, but for its potential to hide threats. That Christmas in Baxter State Park was meant to be quiet and healing, but it became a lesson in vigilance, awareness, and the unsettling realization that people can be just as predatory as any animal in the forest. Even months later, I still dream of those deep boot prints circling my cabin, and I know that night could have ended very differently. I've since learned to prepare more carefully for trips, always letting someone know where I am, always keeping communication devices charged, and most importantly, understanding that when you're truly alone, you are never as safe as you think. The memory of that folded note, lying under the snow, with the simple words, "I saw you," remains vivid in my mind. It was a tangible reminder that someone had been there, a silent witness to my isolation, and that even in the most peaceful, snowy wilderness, the presence of another human could be the most frightening thing of all. That Christmas, the forest taught me a lesson I won't forget. Being alone does not mean being safe, and the quiet can hide eyes, intentions, and dangers that you can neither see nor predict. I left the park that day with relief, but also with a new caution, a heightened awareness of what it means to be isolated, and an understanding that the peace I had sought in solitude could be shattered in a single night, without warning, by someone who simply wanted to make me aware that I was being watched. Even as I retell the story now, it feels real, immediate, and raw. The cold bite of the snow, the sound of crunching steps circling the cabin, the sharp clarity of boot prints in the frost, and the folded piece of paper with its simple message. These are the things that remain. Not ghosts, not fantasies, just a person walking through the snow, choosing to mark my presence and leave. It was terrifying in its reality, and it was a lesson I've never forgotten. That Christmas in Baxter State Park was not peaceful, but it was unforgettable, and it changed the way I view isolation, the wilderness, and the quiet moments I once thought were safe. The fear, the adrenaline, the careful observation of every sound and shadow that night stayed with me long after I returned home. I don't take isolation lightly anymore. I know that in the real world, danger doesn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying. It just needs to be deliberate. And in that moment, with snow piling up outside my cabin, I understood how exposed we really are, even when we think we are alone, and how a simple message, written in pencil and left under snow, could make a person understand the sharp edge of fear in the most real way imaginable. I never returned to the cabin, and I don't think I ever will. The thought of those prints, the circling, the quiet, and the paper is too vivid. Even the memory of waking up and seeing the second set of tracks leading into the forest makes my skin crawl. It was a lesson in human presence, isolation, and the raw, terrifying power of someone choosing to let you know they were there, and that they had watched you. That Christmas, I didn't just escape a possible danger. I learned what it meant to be truly alone, and how fragile safety can be when someone else decides to make their presence known in the quietest, coldest way possible. The cabin, the snow, the forest, they all seem peaceful in memory, but I know better, and I will never forget the three words that made everything real. I saw you. I stepped outside into the backyard to cool off after the long Christmas day. Everyone else in the house was asleep, and the air felt heavy inside. Even though it was winter, the California night had that mild coolness that never really bites, just settles softly on the skin. The sky was dark but clear, the kind of dark where you can still see the faint outline of the neighbor's roof and the trees behind the alley. I could hear the steady hum of Route 99 far off, thick and low, like a constant reminder that even on a quiet night, the world kept moving. I walked a few steps into the yard, just breathing and letting everything slow down. Then I noticed something about the fence on the right side, near the back corner. Two of the wooden planks were pushed inward. At first I thought maybe it was just old wood, or maybe the wind had warped it. But as I stepped closer, I saw the dirt below the fence was disturbed. Fresh footprints, clear and sharp, led straight from that gap toward the back of the house. A cold feeling rushed through my chest. It didn't make sense. I had been outside earlier in the day, hanging some leftover lights, and the fence was fine then. The dirt was smooth. Nothing was out of place. But now the ground had these new marks, fresh enough that they still held their shape. They were from a single person, big enough to belong to a grown man. The tracks led straight toward the area beside the house where the shed stood. I didn't call out. I didn't even breathe normally. I stood there staring at the fence gap and the footprints, feeling the air around me get strange and tense. I kept thinking maybe someone's dog ran through, but these were not paw prints. They were long, deep footprints, spaced like someone had been walking quickly, but trying not to run. I turned around slowly and walked back toward the sliding glass door, keeping my head low and my eyes on the yard, even though every small sound around me felt like it was coming from right behind my neck. When I reached the sliding door, I grabbed the handle and looked at my reflection without meaning to. That's when I saw something move behind me. It was fast, just a dark shape lowering itself down behind the shed like it was trying to disappear from sight. I froze in place so hard my shoulders locked. My breath caught in my throat. The shape wasn't clear, but I could see enough to know it was a person, not an animal, not a shadow. Someone had been standing upright near the shed and had ducked down when they saw me turning. I stayed completely still. I didn't even blink for a few seconds because I was scared the movement of my eyelashes would give something away. I didn't know how close that person was, or if they were watching me from just a few feet away. The yard felt too open, too exposed. The night that had felt cool a moment before now felt sharp and unfriendly. I watched the reflection, waiting for another sign of movement, but the shape didn't rise again. It just stayed low, hidden somewhere behind that small structure. Then I heard the shed door creak, only once. A slow, long creak that stretched through the quiet yard. It didn't sound like the wind. It had weight to it, the sound of someone pulling it open just enough to look out or slip inside. The shed had always been a little stiff when I opened it, but this was different. The sound was so soft it felt intentional, like whoever was there didn't want to make noise but couldn't avoid that one sound. I felt a heavy pressure in my chest. I didn't turn around. I didn't try to face the yard directly. Instead, I kept my eyes locked on the reflection in the glass and slowly stepped backward into the house. I moved in tiny steps at first because I didn't trust myself not to trip or slip in panic. When my foot crossed the threshold, I pulled the sliding door shut with both hands as quietly as I could. The moment it clicked into place, I locked it. I stood there in the dark living room, afraid to move because the lights inside the house would make me visible from the yard. I didn't want to give whoever was outside a clear view of the rooms or of me. I reached up and turned off the nearest lamp, then another, then another. I didn't rush. I tried to move slowly, keeping the house dark so I didn't make any silhouette that could be seen from the outside. When I reached the light switch near the hallway, I turned off everything. The whole house went dim except for a few blinking Christmas lights still plugged in upstairs. I let my eyes adjust. My breathing was uneven and loud in my ears. I moved away from the sliding door, keeping low and sticking close to the walls so no one outside could see my shadow. I checked the front door and the windows. I kept thinking every small sound was someone trying to come in. The heater clicked on, and it made me jump. The refrigerator hummed, and I felt my heart jump again. It was like my mind had shifted into a different state, where everything around me felt hostile even though it was just the house settling the way it always did at night. I waited in the dark, standing in the hallway where I could see both the living room and the back of the house. I wasn't sure if the person outside knew I had seen them. I didn't know if they were waiting for me to come out again or if they were searching for a way inside. I stayed there for a long time listening for anything, but the yard stayed quiet. Too quiet. No footsteps. No creaking. Not even the rustling of leaves. It was almost an hour later when the sirens approached. I had called the police earlier, whispering from behind the wall near the front door, explaining what I had seen. They arrived without lights at first, trying not to alert anyone who might still be hiding outside. When they stepped into the backyard, their flashlights cut across the grass and the shed and the fence. The officer closest to the shed called out that the door was wide open. It wasn't just cracked anymore. It was pulled fully open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. Inside, nothing was taken, but things had been moved around. Boxes were shifted. Garden tools were pushed aside. Someone had been in there long enough to look through everything. Another officer walked along the fence line and called attention to the gap I had seen. It had been widened even more. Whoever had come through must have gone back the same way, pushing the planks farther out to make room. The footprints that had moved toward my house now had matching ones leading back out into the narrow dirt alley. The officers followed the prints with their flashlights for several yards, but they faded away quickly on the hard, packed ground. There were no tire marks. No sign of a vehicle. Just a trail that stopped at a patch of dry dirt where the ground was too firm to leave impressions. They never caught whoever it was. In the days after, I kept replaying the moment I saw that shape duck down behind the shed. It stuck in my mind because it wasn't fast the way an animal would move. It was careful. Controlled. Someone who knew exactly how to hide themselves. Someone who had been standing just a few feet away from me in the dark on Christmas night. I kept thinking about how quiet they had been, how slow the shed door had opened, how they didn't rush or panic when they realized I saw movement behind me. They had moved like someone who had done this before, like someone who knew how to read a yard, how to slip into a shed, how to wait in silence. I started checking the fence every morning. I bought stronger locks for the shed and installed a motion light above the sliding door. Even then, for weeks, I avoided stepping out into the yard at night. Every time I heard the distant hum of Route 99, I remembered standing in that open space in the dark, staring at footprints that didn't belong there. The police told me it was probably a drifter or someone passing through, maybe looking for tools to steal or a quiet place to hide for a while. But that didn't make the feeling go away. The feeling that someone had watched me from only a few feet away. The feeling that if I had walked just a little closer to the shed, I might have seen more than a shape in the reflection. I might have seen a face. I might have changed the outcome of that night in a way I didn't want to imagine. The house eventually felt normal again, but the memory stayed sharp. And every Christmas since, when the night gets quiet and the air feels mild and still, I find myself looking toward the fence, half expecting to see that gap again, and the tracks leading toward the place where I had once stood alone in the dark. I worked the Christmas shift at a large hospital in Toronto. It was one of those nights where the city outside was quiet, the snow softening the usual hum of traffic, and inside the hospital, the hallways felt almost empty. The main areas were calm, but the emergency room never really slept. Even on Christmas, the ER had a constant flow of patients' minor injuries, accidents from holiday cooking, a few drunk falls, but nothing that could fill the space with real chaos. Most of the hospital's wings, though, were eerily silent. The fluorescent lights flickered in certain hallways, some machines were left running with only the occasional beep, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint odor of old carpeting hung heavily in the air. Around 3 in the morning, I had to take some lab results down a floor. I worked in the laboratory on the 4th floor, and the patient wards were on the 3rd. It was a simple enough task, but it required taking the back stairwell. I avoided it most of the time during the day because it was always freezing, the concrete walls unpainted and raw, and the smell of disinfectant seemed trapped in the porous surfaces, seeping into my skin no matter how tightly I held my coat. The stairwell had a kind of oppressive silence too, the kind that made you notice every sound you made. Even the creak of the metal steps under my shoes felt unusually loud. I carried the folder with the lab results in one hand and my coat in the other, making sure the papers wouldn't slide out or flap in the draft that seemed to come from nowhere. I started down the stairs slowly, feeling the chill settle into my bones almost immediately. The first few steps were uneventful, the usual groan of the metal and the distant hum of the hospital above me. As I reached the second landing, I stopped. I heard something I wasn't expecting, breathing. At first, I thought it was my own, quickened from rushing down the steps, but it wasn't. The sound was steady, slow, and controlled. It didn't match the rhythm of my heartbeat, or the speed of my descent. It was coming from below in the section of the stairwell where the light had burned out months ago. The concrete there was black, an unbroken shadow that swallowed everything a few feet away. I could see the outline where the light stopped, the dim edges making the darkness seem deeper than it should be. I froze for a moment, holding my breath to listen more carefully. The breathing continued, deliberate and even. It didn't quicken or falter. Whoever, or whatever, it was seemed calm, like they were intentionally staying quiet, staying patient and waiting. My mind raced. The hospital was supposed to be secure. All staff had badges. Security checked the stairwells regularly, and all the emergency doors leading outside were locked. Visitors weren't supposed to be here at this hour. And yet, there it was, that sound. My pulse quickened, my hands gripping the folder tighter. I considered turning back, running up the stairs to the lab and calling security from there, but something made me hesitate. The stairwell was long, straight, and narrow. Running blindly could make me trip, fall, or draw attention to myself. The breathing didn't rush, but it was unnerving in its steadiness, like a predator waiting in silence. I slowly stepped backward toward the landing I had just passed, keeping my eyes fixed on the edge of the darkness. I didn't want to look directly into it. The absence of light made it impossible to know what I was facing. The air felt heavier as I moved, the cold more biting, as if the shadows themselves pressed against me. I could hear the faint echo of my boots on the metal stairs, each step announcing my presence, and I had to remind myself to move deliberately, not too fast, not too slow. The breathing got louder, or maybe my ears just adjusted, but it stayed measured even. It didn't panic, it didn't change. I reached the door to the 3rd floor. My hand shook slightly as I pushed it open, relief flooding me at the sight of the dimly lit hallway beyond. The door felt warmer in my hand, the air of the floor lighter than the stairwell, and I forced myself to step inside quickly, closing the door behind me. The click of the lock felt like a shield, but then I heard it. A scraping sound, soft but distinct, like a shoe dragging against concrete. It came from the stairwell. Just before the door clicked fully shut, my stomach dropped. Whoever had been there had followed me, or at the very least, had moved closer in the darkness while I was focused on leaving. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't stop the instinctive shiver that ran through me. I called security immediately. The dispatcher's voice was calm but questioned why I hadn't waited for backup. I explained, my voice tight, about the breathing, the darkness, the scraping noise. Security responded quickly, 2 officers heading straight for the stairwell. I stayed by the floor's nurses' station, watching them disappear into the dim corridor. They checked every corner, every landing, every darkened stairwell, but found nothing. No one was there. The stairwell was empty, as if the person I had sensed had vanished into thin air. The only trace left was the footprints. Large, boot-shaped, pressed into the dust of the steps, ending abruptly where the burnt-out light began. No drag marks, no other sign of movement, just the footprints stopping at the edge of the shadow. The officers photographed them, marked them in the report, and promised to investigate further. But even after they left, a sense of unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, following me, and possibly waiting for the perfect moment to appear. I went back to the laboratory after my shift ended, trying to focus on the routine of closing up, logging samples, and preparing for the next day. But every creak in the building, every hum of the overhead lights, every faint draft in the hall made me tense. I started leaving doors open slightly, checking corners twice, and moving with more caution than usual. I found myself avoiding the back stairwell entirely for the next week, even though it added extra steps and time to my rounds. The hospital felt different. The quiet corners and long, empty hallways that had never bothered me before suddenly seemed like spaces where something could wait, silently and patiently. Over the following days, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a maintenance worker. Maybe someone had sneaked in from outside, though the hospital's security was generally tight. Maybe it was just my imagination, a combination of fatigue, the darkness, and the stress of a holiday shift. But rationalization didn't erase the images in my head, the slow, deliberate breathing, the scraping sound, the footprints ending in darkness. It didn't erase the physical feeling of being watched, the weight in my chest that didn't go away, even in the bright lights of the main floor. Then, about a week later, the hospital posted a security notice. They had reviewed footage from exterior cameras near the service entrance and delivery doors. Footage showed someone in a maintenance uniform entering the hospital late at night. They weren't on any staff roster and didn't have proper ID. The person had moved through service corridors, avoiding main hallways and cameras, and disappeared into the stairwell I had used. Security couldn't track them after that, and there was no record of them leaving the building. The description matched the size suggested by the boot prints: tall, large build, deliberate movements. There was no further explanation. They assumed the person had found a way to hide in an unused part of the building, or had exited through an emergency route that bypassed cameras, but they never found anyone. After that, I continued working at the hospital, but I avoided the back stairwell entirely. I took extra precautions, letting security know when I moved between floors, making sure someone else was nearby. I noticed other staff started mentioning strange occurrences too. Footsteps in empty corridors, doors left open that should have been closed, shadows moving in places that cameras didn't cover. No one could say for sure what was happening. There were no ghosts, no magical explanations, only the real possibility that someone had been inside the hospital without anyone noticing, moving through spaces we thought were secure. It was the kind of reality that felt worse than fiction because it could be true. Anyone could have been there, watching, waiting, and the next time, they might not stop at the stairwell. By the end of the month, security added extra cameras and started locking certain stairwells completely. The back stairwell remained closed to staff except for maintenance checks, and for months, I avoided it entirely. Every time I passed it, even from a distance, I felt that same tight knot of unease in my chest. The hospital returned to its usual rhythm, busy and noisy during the day, quiet at night. But for me, something had changed. I had seen firsthand that even the most secure place could hide someone in the shadows, someone who moved deliberately and without fear, leaving only traces behind. And every time I walked the hallways in the middle of the night, I couldn't help but glance at every darkened corner, every burnt-out light, every place where the shadows could swallow a person completely, leaving nothing but the faint sound of breathing in the cold air. It never happened again after the stairwell was locked and the cameras added, but I never forgot that night. It changed the way I saw the hospital, the quiet spaces, and even the simple act of moving through them. I had faced something real, tangible, and completely human, and it reminded me that sometimes the most unsettling things aren't monsters or spirits. They're people moving through the world silently, watching, waiting, and leaving no explanation. The fear stayed with me, not as a fleeting thought, but as a lasting caution. Even in places you think are safe, there can be shadows where someone is waiting. And sometimes, all you have are footprints that stop at the edge of the light. The hospital eventually added new security protocols, and my shifts became routine again. The stairwell was permanently locked except for emergency use, and all maintenance work had to be scheduled during the day. I never saw the person again, and the footprints were the only evidence anyone had. I adjusted to the new routine, but even years later, when I walked through quiet halls at night, I could feel the memory of that controlled breathing, the scrape of boots on concrete, and the unnerving presence of someone who shouldn't have been there. I learned to respect the silence, the shadows, and the spaces where light didn't reach. And in doing so, I understood that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or stories. They're real people, moving quietly, unnoticed, with intentions we can only guess at, leaving only traces and the lingering weight of fear behind. It stayed with me, not like a story, but like a warning I carried everywhere. The world is full of people who can be unseen, and sometimes, that's more terrifying than anything else. I was driving south through New Mexico on Christmas Eve, trying to make it from Albuquerque to Las Cruces before the weather got worse. The sky had that heavy look it gets right before a real snowstorm, and the wind on I-25 kept pushing the car a little to the side every few minutes. The road was already getting covered in a thin layer of white that made the lanes disappear. I kept the heater on full blast because the cold outside felt sharp enough to cut through the glass. I remember thinking I should have left earlier in the day, but I had tried to squeeze in a few things before the trip and ended up leaving right when the storm warnings went out. By the time I reached the stretch of desert between the small towns, the snow was coming down harder than I had ever seen in that part of New Mexico. Thick, fast flakes that made the headlights look useless. The wind dragged the snow sideways, and it felt like driving through a white tunnel that never ended. The car started sliding a little even at low speed. I had both hands on the wheel, and my shoulders tight from how hard I was gripping it. I saw a few cars pulled to the shoulder with their hazards on, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I had to do the same. When the tires spun slightly during a gentle curve, I decided I couldn't risk staying on the highway. I took the next exit, which led to a small road with barely any lights. It looked like it might lead into a farming area or an industrial patch. The visibility was so low that the world just looked like a flat blur of white with a few shapes sticking out here and there. I drove slowly, following what I thought was the road, until I saw a flicker of light ahead. It was an old roadside motel, the kind built decades ago when this road probably had more traffic. The sign was hanging crooked, one side missing light bulbs and the other flickering like it was fighting to stay alive. There were maybe 10 rooms in a single line, all with their doors facing the parking lot. Half the windows were dark. Only 2 of the rooms had their lights on. The place looked like it was barely surviving, but I didn't care. I needed somewhere safe to wait out the storm. I parked in front of the office, and the snow was already deep enough that it pushed against my boots when I stepped out. The wind felt like needles on my face. Inside the small office, it smelled like old carpet and stale coffee. A man who looked like he was in his late 60s sat behind the counter. His hair was gray and long in the back, and he had a tired look, like he had been waiting for the storm to pass as much as anyone else. I paid in cash because the card machine wasn't working due to the weather. He gave me a key with a cracked plastic tag and pointed toward the far end of the row. The room was simple. Old wooden dresser, thin curtains, a bed with sheets that smelled clean but looked worn, and a small bathroom with a flickering light. The heater rattled when I turned it on, but it worked. The wind kept beating against the window, and the snow was piling up against the door. I washed my face with cold water and climbed into the bed, hoping to sleep for a few hours until the sun came up or the storm calmed down. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the dark. It felt like something pulled me out of sleep fast, like a sudden jolt inside my chest. The room was cold even with the heater running. The clock on the nightstand said a little after 1 in the morning. I lay there for a few seconds listening to the wind outside. Then I heard something else. A slow, steady metallic sound. It was the door handle, not shaking or banging. It was moving with a soft, careful motion like someone testing it gently. Metal brushing against metal, a tiny click, then another click, as if someone was pressing down just enough to feel resistance. I didn't move. I just listened with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The only light came from the little orange heater glow. The handle clicked again. I felt a pressure in my throat, like I couldn't swallow. I got out of bed slowly, moving as quietly as I could, and pressed my back to the wall. The air felt frozen around me. The sound stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe the wind pushed something against the door. Then a new sound came. Knuckles, or maybe fingertips, dragging down the surface of the door from top to bottom. Not a knock, just a slow scrape. A dull, dry sound, as if someone was dragging their hand lightly but deliberately. The sound moved from the top of the door down to the bottom. Then again, this time slower. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. I forced myself to go to the peephole. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stand not knowing. When I looked through it, there was nothing. Not darkness like the usual night or shadows from the parking lot lights. It was completely black, like something was covering the peephole from the outside. The only way that could happen was if someone was standing right in front of it, blocking everything out. Another dragging sound came, but this time lower, right near where the bottom of the door met the floor. I stepped back so fast I almost tripped over my own feet. My breathing wasn't steady anymore. I moved around the room, turning off the lamp, the bathroom light. Even the heat glow bothered me. I left only enough light to not trip. I didn't want whoever was outside to know where I was standing inside. I sat down on the floor beside the bed, pressing my back against it. I kept my eyes on the door and tried to keep my breathing quiet. Every few minutes, I would hear the soft sound of something shifting outside, like weight stepping lightly on snow. Once, I thought I heard the handle again, but it might have been the wind moving something metal on the building. I didn't move from my spot. The cold started creeping into the room more as time passed, and my legs got stiff from sitting there, but I didn't dare get up. The hours felt like they stretched forever. The storm outside kept roaring, but every now and then the wind would drop for a moment, and during those silences I could swear I heard faint movement just outside the door. Not walking away, not walking toward, just shifting like someone waiting. I stayed like that until the sky finally started getting lighter, a pale color barely visible through the thin curtains. I didn't unlock the door until the sun was fully up, and even then, I opened it slowly, pushing it with my foot instead of my hand. The cold hit me right away and the air felt too quiet. The snow in front of my door had a set of footprints, not boots from earlier. These were fresh, pressed deep into the snow, leading from my door across the parking lot to the other side. The motel was almost silent, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears again. I followed the prints with my eyes until I saw where they ended. They led straight to a room across from mine. The door of that room was wide open. Snow had blown inside and covered the carpet. The lights in that room were still on, even though the place looked empty. The bed was unmade, and there was a chair sitting in the middle of the room facing the door, as if someone had been sitting there watching the storm. No luggage, no clothes, no person, just the open door and the bright, unnatural stillness inside. I didn't check in further. I didn't try to look for anyone. I walked back to my car, brushed the snow off with shaking hands, and started the engine. The motel office looked empty when I drove past it, but I didn't stop to ask anything. The road back to the highway had deep tire marks that weren't mine, leading away into the white morning. The storm had slowed by then, but the sky still looked heavy. I drove until the motel disappeared into the distance. I kept thinking about those footprints leading from my door to that open room with the lights still on. Someone had walked from one room to the other in the middle of the storm. Slow enough to drag their hand down my door. Calm enough to stand right in front of the peephole without moving. I still wonder if they were waiting for someone to open the door, or if they were looking for an unlocked one. I never drove that road again on Christmas Eve. I still think about the open door and the cold air blowing into that empty room, and I still don't know if the person who stood outside my door ever left the motel after I did. I worked a late cleaning shift at a grocery store just outside Flagstaff on December 23rd, and I still remember how cold the air felt when I stepped out of my car that night. The sky was clear, the kind of dry winter cold that makes your breath feel sharp. The store sat in a quiet strip mall at the edge of town, with a wide empty parking lot lit by those old yellow lights that always flicker at the edges. Most people were already done with their holiday shopping by then, so the place was winding down earlier than usual. My shift didn't end until everything was restocked, cleaned, and the floors were mopped, which usually put me there way past midnight. The store closed at 11, and by around midnight it was just me on the floor and the night manager locked away in his little office at the front. His room had a window looking out toward the registers, but he kept the blinds half shut and his lights dimmed, so it always looked like no one was in there. I rarely heard him because he kept his door closed, and I just tried to get my work done as quickly as possible so I could go home and sleep. I started by restocking canned vegetables in one of the middle aisles. It was quiet except for the hum of the freezers and the soft buzz of the old lights overhead. I always hated how the store sounded that late. During the day you don't notice the building itself, because customers fill it with noise, but at night you can hear the metal shelves creak now and then, or boxes shift slightly on their own in the stock room after the heat cycles off. Every sound feels bigger, every noise feels closer. I was stacking cans and trying to focus on finishing the aisle when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone walking past the far end of the aisle. Tall, a dark green coat. They moved fast, just a quick stride from one side to the other, crossing the opening like they knew exactly where they were going. I looked up right away because I thought maybe someone had hidden in a bathroom stall or slipped past the employees when we were closing. We'd had kids do that before, usually trying to grab snacks after hours. I took a few steps toward the end of the aisle and leaned out so I could see down the next one. It was empty, just all the shelves lined with cereal boxes and the dull shine of the floor under the fluorescent lights. It felt weird because I was sure I had seen someone. The color of the coat stuck with me too clearly for it to be in my head. Dark green, like the shade people wear when it snows outside. I walked down the empty aisles slowly, listening for any sound. It was still completely quiet except for the distant hum of the walk-in freezer fans. When I reached the end, I checked the aisle across from it. Nothing again. But when I stepped forward, I felt the floor under my shoe slip a little, just enough to make me look down. There were wet prints on the tiles. Clear shapes of boot soles. The kind that show melted snow around the edges, smeared a little but still sharp enough that you could see the tread pattern. They started near the end of the aisle and pointed straight toward the back of the store. The prints were spaced far apart like whoever walked there had a long stride. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I hadn't heard the front doors open. And no one was supposed to be locked in after closing. We always checked. I followed the prints with a slow, steady pace, feeling a tight pressure grow in my chest as I got closer to the back rooms. The deeper you go in that part of the store, the colder the air feels because the walls are lined with freezers. There's also this faint metallic smell that never goes away, kind of like cold metal mixed with whatever chemicals they use to clean the floors back there. The footprints led straight to the freezer storage area. I pushed the swinging door open and stepped inside. The floor changed from polished tile to bare concrete, gray and cold. The prints were still clear at first, darker spots of moisture against the cement. They went past the stacks of cardboard boxes, past the metal carts with plastic crates, and then deeper into the room. I followed them until they suddenly stopped. Just ended in the middle of the open floor, far away from any shelves or walls. There wasn't even a tiny smear after the last print. It was like the person lifted straight off the ground or disappeared into thin air. But I didn't want to think in those terms. I tried to tell myself maybe the boots had dried suddenly, or maybe the last step had landed on a patch of dry concrete that didn't show moisture. But the more I looked at it, the more that explanation didn't make sense. The prints were soaked and clear right up until the very last one. The concrete after that was perfectly clean. I stood there for a moment, trying to breathe slow. The air around me felt heavier, colder, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees in just a few seconds. I could hear the freezer fans kick on again in the next room, sending a sharp vibration through the floor. That vibration made the metal shelving tremble a little. I looked around the room and checked every corner. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. No open doors. No gaps between the crates big enough for someone to squeeze into. No way someone could have run or climbed somewhere without me hearing it. The room was open and exposed and bright. I should have been able to see everything. As I stood there, I felt the cold air shift against my face. It was a small movement, but clear, like someone had walked past me fast enough to push the air aside. Not a breeze from a vent, not the usual freezer gust that comes when someone opens a door. This was different. It felt close, personal, like something moved from behind me to my right side in a single smooth pass. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see anything. I only felt that motion against my skin and the little hairs on my arms rise all at once. My throat went dry. The whole room felt wrong, like something was standing just out of reach, waiting for me to turn in the wrong direction. I stepped backward until my shoulder hit one of the metal racks. I kept my eyes on the center of the room where the prints ended, half expecting to see something appear. Nothing did, but the stillness made it worse. It felt as if the room was holding its breath. I left the storage area without looking back. I kept my steps quiet even though I knew that was probably pointless. My hands were shaking by the time I pushed the door open. When I reached the main floor of the store again, the warm air hit me and made the whole moment feel unreal, like I had just walked out of a cold underground tunnel. I tried to keep working for another 30 minutes, but I couldn't focus. Every aisle felt too long. Every corner felt like someone might be standing just out of view. I kept checking the ends of aisles, trying to convince myself I was being stupid, that it was just leftover nerves from seeing those prints. But the feeling didn't go away. The night manager eventually stepped out of his office to grab something from the front counter. He didn't look at me or notice anything wrong. I didn't tell him what happened because I couldn't explain it in a way that didn't sound crazy. Instead, I clocked out a little earlier than usual and left without even finishing the last section I was supposed to mop. When I stepped back outside, the cold Arizona night felt warm compared to that freezer room. Snow had started falling again. It landed soft on my jacket and melted right away. I walked fast to my car, unlocked it, and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine. I kept thinking about those prints stopping in the middle of the concrete. There was no logical reason for that. No normal explanation. No trick of the light. I quit before New Year's. I didn't go back even to pick up my last paycheck. They mailed it to me, and I never argued. It wasn't worth stepping inside that building again. I still don't know what I saw or what walked through those aisles that night. The store was quiet, locked, and empty. But something else had been in there with me. Something that didn't leave through any door I could see. It didn't touch me. It didn't speak. It didn't even show itself. But it walked far enough to leave footprints that ended in a clean patch of concrete, in a room that had nowhere to go. That was enough for me. I knew I wasn't staying another night in that place. I woke on Christmas night to an uneasy stillness. The city outside my apartment in Chicago was unusually quiet, with snow muffling the usual hum of traffic. It had been snowing lightly all evening, frosting the streets and rooftops in a thin, sparkling layer. I remember looking out the window earlier, watching the flakes drift down in the yellow glow of the streetlights. It was peaceful, almost serene. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person awake in the entire city. I fell asleep thinking about the Christmas morning I had planned for myself, with coffee and a small stack of presents, all tucked neatly under my tiny tree in the living room. At around 4 in the morning, I woke to a sound that made my stomach sink. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible under the steady hum of the radiator and the occasional distant car horn. My ceiling creaked once, then again. At first, I thought it might just be the building settling, the way old brick and concrete do in the cold. I closed my eyes trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then it came again, more deliberate this time. Heavy, slow creaks, spaced evenly apart, like someone was walking carefully but with weight. I froze in bed, listening. The sound was coming from above me. My building has a flat roof with a metal hatch in the top stairwell. It's almost always locked. I had never been up there myself, and I'd only ever heard the janitor mention it once. The thought that someone could be on the roof above my apartment hit me like a cold rush of air. My heart started to beat faster. The steps continued, slow, heavy, deliberate. They moved across the roof, sometimes creaking the ceiling in my apartment as if the weight above me was shifting slightly. I tried to tell myself it was snow sliding off the roof or maybe some branch that had broken under the weight, but the pattern didn't fit. Snow falls in random patterns, and branches snap suddenly. This was steady, regular, and purposeful. The steps stopped directly above my bedroom, my ears strained in the cold, quiet night. Then came a light metallic tapping tap. Tap, it was subtle but sharp. Something tapped the hatch. It could have been wind, or maybe a stray piece of ice. Tap, another tap followed, deliberate and controlled. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just listened, frozen in place, imagining someone on the other side of that metal hatch just above me. Time passed slowly. Minutes felt like hours. The tapping stopped. The footsteps moved again, retreating, leaving only the quiet hum of the radiator and the muffled city sounds through the snow. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that what I had heard wasn't real. I kept picturing the hatch above me, the faint metal edges in my mind, imagining someone climbing, looking down, watching. By the time the sun started to rise, I knew I had to check. I didn't want to, but the curiosity mixed with the lingering fear made me move. I put on a thick coat, boots, and gloves, careful not to slip on the icy stairs. The stairwell was quiet, the concrete floors cold under my feet. I reached the top floor, and there it was, the hatch. It wasn't fully open, but it was ajar, just enough for snow to have blown in around the edges. Small piles of snow dotted the landing, and the edges of the metal were wet from melted frost. The latch was loose, swinging slightly with the wind. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting someone to be on the roof still. The wind hit me immediately, cold and sharp. The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped out onto the flat roof. The morning light reflected off the ice and snow, making everything look brighter and sharper than it had in the darkness. I scanned the surface carefully. The first thing I noticed was a single line of footprints in the snow. They were heavy, deep impressions that led from the hatch straight to the edge of the building. I moved closer, heart hammering in my chest. The prints were large, as if someone had been wearing heavy boots, and there was a slight drag in the toe area, like the person was moving carefully, testing the surface. The line ended abruptly at the edge of the roof, where the snow had blown away, exposing the concrete. There were no return prints. No sign that the person had turned back. Just one line of heavy footprints that stopped at the edge, leaving me staring down at the street far below. I stepped carefully along the prints, examining the snow. The wind had shifted since the night, blowing some of the lighter powder around, but the deep impressions were still clear. Whoever had walked across this roof had come from the hatch, moved slowly and carefully, and then disappeared at the edge. There was no ladder, no rope, nothing to suggest how someone could have left the roof. My stomach turned, and I realized I wasn't thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural. This was real. Someone had been here, and they had left in a way that I couldn't understand. I moved back to the hatch and inspected it more closely. The latch had been forced just enough to let the door open. The hinge marks were faint but visible, and there was a small scratch along the metal edge. Snow and dirt from the shoes had brushed along the frame, leaving tiny streaks that ended near the top of the hatch. The wind had blown some of it away, but it was enough to tell me that someone had climbed up here, intentionally or by accident. I went down the stairs slowly, my mind racing. I kept thinking about the footprints, about how they stopped at the edge. I tried to imagine someone climbing down the side of the building, but the walls were smooth, the edge sheer. Chicago rooftops are flat, but tall, and this building was 12 stories high. There was no way to climb down without equipment, not safely. And yet someone had been here. Someone had come up, walked across the roof, and then vanished at the edge. The rest of the day I stayed inside, staring out the window at the street below. The city had started to wake, the quiet replaced by the usual hum of cars, buses, and pedestrians. People were walking, bundled against the cold, carrying packages, heading to work or errands. I kept imagining them walking underneath my building, completely unaware of what had happened above them, unaware of the footprints that led to nowhere. I reported the incident to the building management that afternoon. They came up to the roof, inspecting the hatch and the footprints. They noted the latch had been left unsecured and promised to fix it, adding an extra lock. They didn't have an explanation for the footprints. Security cameras didn't cover the roof, only the stairwell, so there was no footage to review. They chalked it up to a trespasser, someone who had found the hatch unlocked. But even the superintendent admitted it was strange. The footprints were heavy, deliberate, and there was no sign of them leaving. Over the next few days, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I went about my routine, making coffee in the morning, walking to the nearby store, and wrapping the few gifts I had left. But every time I looked at the stairwell at the hatch, I felt that cold rush again. I replayed the sound of the footsteps in my head, the metallic tapping, the way it had stopped right above my bedroom. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been drunk, someone looking for shelter in the cold. Maybe they had left using another exit I hadn't noticed. But the single line of footprints that ended at the edge didn't make sense. I went back to the roof once more a week later, during the day. The snow had melted, leaving only faint traces of ice along the edges. The hatch was securely locked this time. I traced the path of the footprints in my mind, imagining someone walking, weighing their steps carefully, stopping, tapping on the hatch. I imagined how small the world would seem from that height, how easy it would be to disappear from view in the city streets below. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing to suggest anything violent, but the sheer impossibility of it lingered in my mind. I started to notice small changes in my routine. I double-checked the locks on my doors, even the windows. I avoided looking at the hatch in the stairwell. I told myself it had been nothing, that someone had been curious, reckless, or just lost. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, that I had been under someone else's attention in those early hours of Christmas morning. By New Year's, the memory had faded slightly, but it never fully went away. The building management had replaced the hatch with a new, reinforced version. Security cameras were installed to cover the stairwell leading to the roof. Still, I remained cautious. Every winter, when the first snow fell and the quiet settled over the city, I remembered that sound. The slow, heavy steps, the metallic taps, the single line of footprints leading to nowhere. I never found out who had been up there, or how they left. No one in the building reported anything missing, no one else had heard the footsteps. It was as if they had only been there for me, crossing the roof above my apartment in the quietest hours, testing the metal hatch, leaving only a line of heavy footprints in the snow. It was a realistic, human intrusion, but one that I could never explain. Someone had accessed the roof, had been above my bedroom in the middle of the night, and had vanished in a way that made no sense. I came to accept that the city holds small, unexplained moments like this, people moving through the same spaces we occupy, leaving traces that make no logical sense, disappearing before we can understand. Years later, I still think about that Christmas night. The image of the footprints, the hatch slightly open, the edge of the roof looming stays with me. It was real, it was human, and it was terrifying in a way that no ghost story could ever match. The city can feel safe, quiet, and mundane during the day, but at night, there are spaces that even the most ordinary buildings can hide secrets in. That hatch, that roof, those footprints, they became a part of how I understand the city, a reminder that even in the heart of winter, on a night meant for warmth and celebration, the world above can hold danger, curiosity, and moments that leave no trace behind. I never climbed the roof again. I never left the hatch unsecured. And every Christmas, when snow starts to fall and the city quiets down, I glance at the stairwell, thinking of that line of footprints, and feel that same shiver in my chest. It is a memory I carry, a real encounter that needed no imagination, no fantasy, just a human presence that left its mark in the cold Chicago night and vanished forever into the unknown. That Christmas, in the heart of the city, I learned something I couldn't unlearn. The world is full of small, impossible moments, and some footprints, once made, never return.